Good morning, what's going on? Today is all about advanced ToB gear choices and how you can pick the perfect setup for your trio to 5-man money raids. I'll cover a 1-down bloat setup for GM cheese, and I'll even help you on your way for making PB or world record setups. This video has been long due. I'm making this video because I see a lot of lab codes. People trying to reinvent the wheel and just seriously hurting their own performance. I actually get asked for setups quite a bit, but there isn't one perfect setup, so I'm going to help you figure out your perfect setup once and for all. Starting off with advanced to max efficiency, no trade money raid setups, the goal is to get good average raids with consistently good rooms without playing too much for potential. This means we'll bring overkill defense reduction and a solid amount of foot to be able to deal with happy mistakes. Personally, for my money rates, I like to tone down my setup to a very comfortable level while still being effective, but I'll get into the choices you can make in just a second. Let's start with the basics that every role uses. After that, I'll get into role and skill specific setups. Okay, so obviously we're taking max melee with Scythe. We'll also bring ToB, so add some dragon arrows. Next up, everyone should always bring dragon warhammer with defender, claws, chally and a BGS. Technically, only 3 people should really need a BGS, but like I said, it can't hurt to have overkill spec reduction, as you don't want to spend 3 minutes on a 200 defense Zarpus. As I just mentioned, everyone should have a ToB, and we also want to bring a blowpipe. Everybody should bring Void Range and an Anguish for their range switch, though I'll get back to that during the melee DPS section. Finally, we're going to need at least a mage weapon on every role, so let's add a Sang Staff. That wraps up the must-haves on every role, although we can actually add some must-have consumables. These include 1 Divine Super Combat, 1 Regular Super Combat, a Restore to be safe, although you could leave this out if you're a sweaty prayer flicker, a Salve Amulet, and of course a Rune Pouch. Let's reorder what we have so far, just so that it's a bit more organized. I like having my one-way switches for spec and blowpipe flicks and such on the left side of my inventory, putting them closer to the boss or mob I'm going to click after equipping them. We can also equip our range gear to get ready for our pre-fire at Maiden. What we have now is the fundamental setup that we're going to build on for all the roles and skills that I'm going to cover. Let's start with the melee DPS role. As melee DPS, you'll always need a Swiftblade. From here, there are several choices you can make, but some are definitely favored over others. Your best move would be to get on Lunars for Venge with Spellbook Swap for Thralls. If used properly, this is 100% the most value you can get out of your currently available inventory slots. Alternatives are ZCB with Bolts, Souls and Godbook, any amount of Inquisitor pieces for more accurate hammer specs, Lightbearer Ring for Rato P1, a Tentacle Whip or Blade of Saldor, an additional regular super combat, and Water Runes plus 1 or 2 range pots for Potion Share. If you're bringing ZCB, this will be used on Maiden and Nilo Boss, and maybe Zarpus if you're on good pace and care enough to Godbook. On Maiden you would Warhammer spec and then proc Death Charge of Crabs to be able to regen for the ZCB spec, so you'd also have to bring Soul Runes for Death Charge, as well as a Godbook to guarantee its usefulness on the Nilo Boss to be able to chally into ZCB spec by booking just after wave 20. The Godbook can then also be used for P1, again if you care enough on good pace. Inquisitors is probably the least useful option, but if you don't want to spellbook swap and aren't doing any of the other things either, it's better than bringing 12 Anglerfish. Lightbearer is good in Force because Rato basically saves you 2 cycles over regular Hato, which comes down to about 6 seconds on average. However, from my experience, Rato is much more variable than Hato, and you're also tanking more autos, leaving you with less food. I think it's good, but it's also a little bit risky, and that's why I personally wouldn't choose it for quote-unquote chill money raids. Of course, before you bring it, confirm with your teammates that you're doing Rato. I'll put the sheet in the description. Tentacle Whip and Blade of Saldor are almost solely used in trios, and its main use is to get a tiny bit more potential to 2-down P2 Versic Reds. Additionally, you could use it instead of a Claw Scratch when you're on the Claw Fix tick at Zarpus, and maybe to lazy proc the purple during P2. Blade is slightly stronger though, so if you don't care about the purple, use a Blade. Unless trioing, don't bring this. The extra super combat can be nice if you often catch yourself getting drained during Maiden. This is more of a quality of life thing, allowing you to be slightly more AFK during your Maidens. Otherwise, this is a useless option. I know potion sharing has been the ranger's role for ages, but I have bad news for all of you melee DPSers out there. Nowadays, the ranger has even less space than you, so you'd do well to offer potion sharing instead, if you can fit it. You can pick as many of these options as you'd like, and though, yes, the more you take, the faster times you'll be able to get, if we're talking money rates, you'll find that toning it down a little will help you clutch some of those rates that just go horribly wrong for whatever reason. Happens to the best, you know? My personal go-to looks something like this. If I feel like I might have to tick it often, I would replace an angler with a Guthix rest, and if I want to be lazy at maiden, I will bring that extra super combat. You can bank one range potion, but by the time the Nilo boss spawns, you and your team will have lost several max hits on your T-bows, so being able to repot the team is desirable. And yes, I could equip the Hammer and Defender for an additional space, but I simply don't feel like I need the extra angler, and I'm too lazy to juggle it anyway. Just my preference, do whatever you want. Some meleeers opt to bank Void. Personally, I'm not a fan of this in money rates, but it does allow for both Spellbook Swap, Inquisitor or ZCB, as well as Potion Share, leading to more accurate hammers or higher potential raids. You trade off some Nilo boss damage for more consistently getting bosses to 0 defense, and whichever you like better is something you have to decide for yourself. Inquisitor is pretty low priority in my opinion, so I would only do this to apply coordinated ZCB tech for Maiden, which is borderline PB or Rack strategy, and as I said, I don't want to make things too complicated for our money rate setups. Next I want to discuss the range setup, so let's start with our fundamental setup and see what we can add. Okay, so the ranger will want to bring a backpack unless you're okay with losing 300k in darts every single raid. We're talking about money rates though, so let's assume we bring it. Additionally, the ranger must bring chins and buckler. This is why the ranger has less space than the melee DPS. From here, the ranger actually has the same options as the melee DPS. CCB with bolts, souls and godbook, any amount of inquisitor pieces, light bearer, a tentacle whip or blade, additional super combat and potion share. The same reasoning for each option applies to the ranger, so refer back to the melee DPS section if you don't know what to pick. However, make sure at least one of you has potion share. This is the setup I'd be using as a ranger. Notice that I could fit in additional stuff like some inquisitor or light bearer or whip, but for money rates I would choose convenience and quality of life. Next up is the melee freeze, and starting off with the fundamental setup, we have to add a 5-way mage switch with Kodai, Occult, Torm, Ansi top and bottoms. We must also add Swiftblade and a heart for Nilo. Your inventory is pretty much done now, but if you want to be fancy, you can bring an Elitness Ward for a Barrage max hit, and or the Lightbearer ring should your team want to do Rato. This role doesn't exist in Trio, so you'd never bring a whip. My go-to setup looks like this, and I actually swapped the mage gear to the top for inventory management purposes. As for the mage, they will use the exact same setup as the melee freeze, except the Swiftblade is an extra mage switch. This should always be the Elitness Ward, and if you want to be fancy, you could add a Mage Arena 2 cape for a max hit on Sang. You could also bring Lightbearer, but if you're going to be player 1 for Rato, you don't actually need a ring at all. The sheet works with 3 rings, with player 1 being the one without a ring. Since most teams do orb order for their P1 methods, this is usually the case for you. I just want to talk about one last thing. Bring max mage with Ansi hat and cape and ward and boots and ring and fucking, I don't know, blessing at your own risk. You won't have room for mistakes, and losing ticks will make it extremely not worth the extra max hit or two. If you're not 100% tick perfect due to your 28-way mage switch, I guarantee you're losing more than you're gaining, so I highly suggest bringing the 6-way or even only a 5-way. A 5-way without Ansi bottoms and with the Elitness Ward is slightly better, but also a little bit more annoying to inventory manage while switching in places like Maiden and Nilo boss. Up to you, as it's only one max hit difference between the Ansi legs. Obviously both is preferred, but in some teams the extra space is just a safer option. Your raid can be as efficient as you want, but if you're wiping even one raid out of every 10, you're losing GP per hour. In trios you'd also want to add a whip or blade. That's it for our money rate setups, but as I promised, I'll talk a little bit about one-downing and how to make setups for this. Let's set some goals for our setup that we'll keep in mind while building it. As I mentioned, I'm going to give you a GM cheese setup and help you through the thought process of making it. So since it's a one-down GM setup, I'm assuming a relatively low skill level, and as such I don't want the setups to be too complicated or difficult to use. Keeping the raid simple will help everyone focus on what's most important. Keeping it simple includes minimizing trades and taking a step down from very high skill methods such as ZCBing Maiden. So to list my requirements, I want minimal trades, dins and chins for the Maiden stack, a 1-down bloat, godbook P1 Versic, excessive defense reduction, and ample room for food during Versic. First of all, we're going to bin all the extra stuff. This means we'll take the fundamental setups and only add what your role actually always needs. These are things like your magic switches and your swift blade. Since we're talking low skill, I suggest duo p-necking. This means only 2 people go into p-neck while the others wait outside. 3 in p-necking is slightly more consistent but requires far more necks and therefore more trades that include temporary gear trades on top of being more difficult to perform. I wouldn't recommend starting with a setup like that, and if you are looking for something like that, you probably wouldn't be watching this video. If you are indeed looking for something like that, I have a Discord that you're welcome to join and take setups and tech from. But I warn you, it's very technical and made for my team for when we go for a rec. So you'll have to figure out what you want to use on your own, as I don't intend to explain every setup to everyone. The Discord link is in the description. Alright, let's make the setup then. These are the fundamental setups from the money raids from earlier with melee gear equipped, so it makes more sense when we bank Void on the meleeers. In these kind of raids you should be godbooking P1, so we add that to each setup. Everyone also needs Book of the Dead for thralls, because the mages will likely want to bring a mage cape so they can spellbook swap to lunars and have venge and thralls on good pace. We also don't need to bring in a restore in 5s. Duo necking means 10 p-necks on each p-necker, aka 10-10, but I prefer 11-10 with 11 necks on whoever goes in first. On average, you don't need to do this, but there's a small chance the first player runs out of necks while the second doesn't, which is easily preventable by doing 11-10 instead of 10-10. You'll probably want to bring a Gothic Rest on only the p-neckers, because they are low HP while everybody else won't have to tick eat, since they are full HP when they enter the room after bloat goes down. Unless you want more complicated trades, you'll have to trade runes between the melee DPSers, so they don't have to bring rune stacks in their inventories. You can bring complementing rune pouches, which basically means you bring runes that the other person can't fit, and vice versa. You then just empty your rune pouch and trade those runes before every room, and you'll both have full access to spellbook swap, venge, thrall, and death charge. Dins is really good in 5's Maiden, so you can bring 1 or even 2 by binning an Inquisitor piece on the 11 next inventory. Inquisitor has a bit more value than in money raids though, because you might reset a bunch to get a good entry into Sot, let's say, and when you get there you really do want your hammers to hit, so that's why it's worth bringing over some alternative. Though it's far from perfect, something like this would do just fine for the meleeers. The only thing meleeers would have to do is trade runes. An alternative to Inquisitor would be ZCBs. ZCBs are very good if you know how to use them, but again I think they outscope the skill level of what these setups are for. The mages will want to bring their 5-way with Hard and Mage Cape, and as you can see they still have a lot of space. You can fill this however you like. Inquisitors, more mage switches, ZCB, and Lightbearer Ring are some suggestions. In more advanced setups, these slots would be used to carry stuff for the meleeers, but we're setting these inventories up to keep things simple. Let's just bring anglers so we don't have to deposit our gear on the meleeers to have enough space for food during Versic. The ranger needs chins, buckler and backpack, but other than that has tons of space because they don't need mage gear nor p-necks. This means they can bring ZCB, their own runes, and the pots for potion sharing. The ranger can then ZCB Maiden to help with a good 50s proc, or even just to guarantee the skip. This looks good to me. It's a pretty solid low trade GM 1-down 5 setup. Far from perfect, but really easy to use. Okay guys, that's it for the guide. These are simply my suggestions, and if you disagree, make sure to write hateful stuff in the comments. The YouTube algorithm appreciates your rage. Either way, I hope this helped. If you have any questions about the video, feel free to ask, and as always, thanks for watching.